welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that we're covering today is New Coke.
Not like the old Coke, but the new Coke.
Not old Coke, classic Coke.
This is one that I'm pretty sure has been suggested by multiple people, hasn't it?
It has, and it's one of those where sometimes you dig into one of these and you don't find enough on the details. I will recommend, before we even get into it, the book that I did eventually find about this that covered it in quite a bit of depth. And really the entire history of Coke. I haven't been able to read the entire book, but the book is called God, Country, and Coca-Cola. And most of the details you'll be hearing today came from that.
Sounds a lot like the book we read about, like Star Wars taking over the world and Nintendo taking over the world and so on.
Yes, it was very informative and very in-depth. And like we have already said, New Coke is one of those bad ideas that nearly everyone has heard of. All right, there's no suspense here about how this story is going to turn out. New Coke is going to come on the market at the end, and it's going to be a failure.
Not like last week, where we didn't know if he was going to make it or not. If he was going to, like, get away with all the stealing. Right,
which he did. Spoilers for people who didn't listen last week about Gregor McGregor. That's not New Coke, Tony.
Are you sure? I'm sure there's some death somewhere. Maybe the New Coke was the result of a body being pushed into the vat.
The thing about New Coke is it's such a well-known failure that you just assume that the outcome must have been obvious from the start. Because you already know and everybody else already knows how this story goes, it's easy to get back into the past and be like, obviously, New Coke was going to fail. To the point where there are even conspiracy theories that New Coke was never even intended to succeed, that it was a marketing gimmick to get people back on the classic Coke wagon and to make everybody sort of coalesce around how great a brand Coke was. But New Coke was not a fake out.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure. I'm as sure as I can be about a fact, Tony. What I know is that the otherwise smart and business-savvy heads of Coca-Cola gave their full blessing to completely replace a formula that had been popular for nearly 100 years. When New Coke, it's literally 1 year shy of the 100-year anniversary of the first Coke being made. And they almost just dunked it into the toilet, and today we're going to talk about why. The first thing you need to know is that in 1984, Coca-Cola was in trouble, relatively speaking. Despite nearly a decade of strong advertising and brand expansion, they had lost an entire % of their grocery store market share to Pepsi in a single year.
1 whole %. I know, I shouldn't mock that. That's probably $1 billion or something like that.
When you're talking about a 100-year brand, Tony, if you lose a % every year, you're not doing great. And the problem that they identified that was driving this shift in consumer taste was taste. Coke just didn't taste as good as Pepsi. Or at least that's what the folks over at Pepsi were saying, and they had testing to back it up.
Sounds like some bribed people, because that's definitely not true.
Well, Tony, Pepsi had the blind taste test Pepsi Challenge ad that ran throughout the 70s, the late 70s. And the premise of this ad was that people, when they did not know what was in their cup, would choose to drink Pepsi, in small amounts at least, more often than they would choose to drink Coke. Not exclusively, not 100% of the people, but more than 50% preferred Pepsi in small doses. Now, we're not digging too far into the Pepsi Challenge stuff, but there are a lot of questions about the methodology and even the realisticness of this particular setup. Malcolm Gladwell has an entire chapter in one of his books about how that Coke actually was a better drink to drink an entire cup of, whereas the blind taste test was a little sip. And Coke would actually point this out in the 80s. They would say, y'all city boys might be sipping your drinks, but we have a whole bottle down here in Texas.
This is the weirdest little feud that I've seen in a while. It's like, yeah, I get it. Like, I'm going to drink a whole can either way, even if it's not as good. I paid for this thing. This is like those Ford ads. Those Ford ads where it's like, oh, we're just consumers and we thought we were buying an Audi, but really it's a Ford Focus. It's like, no, that didn't happen.
Well, if you believe any of the Pepsi challenge hype, then the argument is Coke has this distinctive bite to it. It's a little bit bitter, a little bit just got a little bit of something that kind of pokes your tongue. And that put off some cola drinkers, and the market seemed to clearly be moving toward the arguably sweeter taste of Pepsi. Even people who claimed that Coke was their favorite soft drinks, when they were actually questioned about their buying habits, would admit that they didn't always buy Coke. Sometimes they were buying store brands, sometimes they were buying Pepsi. The favoritism was not going as strong in Coke's favor as they wanted it to. And Pepsi knew they had Coke right where they wanted them. Even after the Pepsi challenge was over, the idea that Coke tasted objectively worse than Pepsi was stuck in the public consciousness. And Pepsi man Dick Alvin, and I apologize, as far as I can tell from my research, his official title was Pepsi man. I'm not actually saying that's the case, but that's how he's cited everywhere. So,
yeah, every single citation is literally Pepsi Man, and it sounds like Florida Man. It's the Pepsi superhero, the soft drink superhero.
Soft drink superhero Dick Alvin said, for them to put that thing to rest totally, they would have to do something to their formula. I mean, dramatically. And I don't think they're going to do that. It's too risky. But risky or not, Coke thought they had to make that dramatic change to survive. And here is the other piece of context you need to understand going into this. Going into New Coke, Coca-Cola as a company had already been making a lot of changes. First of all, just from an organizational structure, from 1960 onward, there was this massive shift in how Coke was managed as a company. Before 1960s, Coca-Cola was essentially a single product company. They made Coca-Cola. And I don't mean they made Coca-Cola products. I mean, they made one type of soft drink, and that was it. And then in 1960, Coca-Cola buys up Minute Maid. And in 1982, they expanded out of the beverage business entirely when they bought up Columbia Pictures. So Coke is doing a lot of changing, and on top of changing the way their business operates, they're also actually changing their drinks. Because it's important to remember, New Coke wasn't the first New Coke. First off, in 1982, Coke released Diet Coke, which was the first soft drink to bear the Coca-Cola brand since the original Coca-Cola. They made a big risk on this because to put Coca-Cola on the side of a can for something that was not the original formulation of Coca-Cola was a massive shift after nearly 100 years of not doing that. They had other drinks. As I mentioned, they bought Minute Maid, and previously in the 60s, they had also released Tab, which was a diet soda, but they were about to put the Coca-Cola name on a new drink, and Diet Coke did really, really well. It was a massive success for Coke, and more importantly, to our purposes, Diet Coke was not designed to taste like regular Coca-Cola. They did not go into the lab to design a drink specifically exactly like Diet Coca-Cola. They designed a sweeter drink. They designed a drink with less kick to it partially because of this perceived criticism that Pepsi tasted better. They were adapting to that idea that maybe people didn't want this bitter drink, and so they went with a sweeter formulation for Diet Coke.
And now Coke Zero is a lot closer to the taste of actual Coke.
Is it? I like Coke Zero better. I wasn't aware
I like
that
Coke
it was...
Zero better, personally. Like, I just think it tastes a lot more like a regular soda than a diet soda. But I also was raised on diet soda.
I almost never drink sugared soda. I know people swear by it and say that it's great, but at this point, the sugar puts me off. I don't know why. I am fine with aspartame or whatever artificial sweetener that they're using. Coke Zero tastes good to me. There's another shift that happens before we get to New Coke, and it's maybe more controversial than even Diet Coke would have been. At least to some people. Coke makes the switch from using sugar to using high fructose corn syrup in their main flagship formulation of Coca-Cola. Now, this is not the first time that they shift the type of sweetener that they've used. In the 30s, they went from cane sugar to beet sugar. And that's sort of the rationale that they use. They say, listen, we're just switching sweeteners again. 99% of people cannot taste the difference. It's not going to affect that much. And this is substantially cheaper. So we're going to get to make a bigger profit. By the way, incidentally, Diet Coke was also a good profit move for them because they could get aspartame or whatever sweetener they were using cheaper than they could get sugar.
I would have thought a synthetic chemical like that would end up costing more. That's interesting.
You have to use less of it, though.
That's true. It's like stevia, and those are like 20 times sweeter than sugar. So you can use barely any of it.
So despite some hiccups, mostly from the bottlers and the distributors who will do some weird lawsuit stuff about, well, you guys said you were going to offer this much pounds of sugar and now you're using not sugar. Despite that, these big changes go pretty well for Coke. They do not have a major problem shifting over from one thing to another and from introducing an entirely new thing in the Coke brand. Now, Coke had been market testing this idea of switching up their signature flavor for years before New Coke finally came out. And they asked countless focus groups what they thought of the idea of a new flavor of Coke. Now, most consumers said they would be okay with the change, but a small minority acted in virulent anger to the idea of a quote-unquote new Coke. And there was also some confusion in the people tested over whether this new Coke flavor would be another line of soft drinks or whether it would replace the original Coke entirely. Now, this is going to be one of the biggest criticisms that will get leveled at New Coke when it comes out. You might say, listen, Coke, you want to try a new thing? Fine. Why have you cannibalized the brand and gotten rid of Coke completely? Why not just release a new kind of soft drink? Just another Coke, Coke 2 or something. But Coke had some problems with this idea. First off, they thought, if we release something called Coca-Cola and it's not the best, then why call it Coca-Cola? They wanted the name Coca-Cola to be associated with the very best a soft drink could be. And if you had two Coca-Colas, there was the concern that now Coca-Cola didn't really mean anything. It was just sort of a name that you could slap on anything. Coca-Cola needed to be special. So that was reason number one. Reason number two was market share. Remember, I mentioned earlier that Coke had lost an entire % of market share to Pepsi, a sweeter brand? Well, the way they calculated market share was to count the number of Coca-Colas sold in a supermarket and then the number of Pepsis sold in a supermarket. And whichever one was higher, then that was the winner. The problem is, if you introduced a new kind of Coke, you have then split your Coke market into two. And it's kind of like the sort of third-party candidate problem, where you have like a third-party candidate run, and maybe he attracts a number of Republicans who are fed up with the current major candidate, but they're not going to vote for a Democrat, right? So then the Democrats win. It's like that, but with soda. And what's on the line is being able to say your soda is the most popular soda in the world. If you have Coke and Coke 2, whatever you would call it, split up into two different things, then Pepsi gets to run away with the prize because their flagship isn't split in two.
I mean, it makes sense in some ways. It's one of those things where I would say that, like, you should just count it by how much your company is selling. But it sounds like they wanted to release another Coke that was almost exactly like Coke. And I know it's not exactly the same, but it's like, if you're going to add a second drink, pick up a second flavor. Don't just do another, like, dark cola drink.
And there was another less obvious and less public force driving the decision to change the Coke formula. Because you have to remember, the 80s was the peak of a massive anti-drug campaign. And the fact that a family-friendly drink like Coca-Cola was made with coca leaves was starting to be bandied about as a negative. Even though there was no cocaine in it, people started now talking about how, oh, you got coca leaves in that Coca-Cola, you know, they used to make it with cocaine and they're trying to get rid of drugs. Why are you drinking a Coca-Cola? Is that even American? So Coke had a problem on their hands with, if they kept the original formulation with the coca leaves, it might look bad in the court of public opinion. Now, if New Coke was going to happen, it needed the approval of Coca-Cola's godfather, Robert Woodruff. Robert Woodruff was the president of Coca-Cola from 1926 to 1954, and he essentially made it the company that it is today. Coca-Cola was good before then, but Robert Woodruff took it from a national company to an international company. He was in charge during the heyday of some of their most classic advertising campaigns. It's the sort of 1950s and 40s era Coke image that you have in your hand, the Coke Santa, all of that stuff would have happened under Robert Woodruff's rule. He hadn't been president since 1954, as I mentioned, but he was still on the board of directors at Coke, and now at the age of 95, he was presented with the plan to change the formula for the drink that he had built his empire on. And the president of Coca-Cola came up and laid out all the arguments. He said, listen, we're losing market share. Public taste is changing. Maybe the thing about the coca leaves, although we don't have a transcript, so we don't know exactly what he said. But he lays out the argument for New Coke, and he says, we have to make a new drink. We might go under if we don't solidify the market better. We can't just stick with the old formula because it's the old formula. Can we change it? And Robert Woodruff agrees that Coca-Cola can be changed. But almost immediately after giving his blessing, he started refusing to eat. And the book that I read portrayed this as if this guy who had been a titan of Coca-Cola essentially willed himself to fade away from the world that had moved on from his vision and the drink that he had loved so much that he built millions upon millions of dollars of a fortune out of it. And he died in March of 1985, 1 month before New Coke hit the market in April.
That is quite the coincidence.
Well, again, I don't know that it's a coincidence. The dude's 95 and he stopped eating.
Yeah, I think that might be playing up how much the idea of like them changing Coca-Cola did to him, but I don't know.
If you are this guy, and I did not get to read the portions of the book that were dedicated to his reign, but from what I can tell, he was very intense. He was very driven. He had a lot of daddy issues going on. If you were going to make a biopic about this guy, it would not be boring. And I think that this kind of person could definitely have said, well, I'm 95. What do I know? Maybe it's time for me to be gone so the world can move on to the new thing. And he willed himself to die. Again, maybe not. who can say for sure? We cannot be inside of his head, but it's not a stupid thing to believe. But maybe he should have stuck around, Tony, because it turns out the new thing was a massive and instant flop.
Well, at least he didn't have to see it before he died.
I guess there is some comfort in that, to not know that you made the absolute wrong call, although it wasn't his idea. He just sort of signed off on it. But Coke loyalists felt betrayed because their formula that they love had been changed, and nobody else could see the point. One journalist at the press conference announcing New Coke said, "If we wanted Pepsi, we'd buy Pepsi." And it's fascinating that Coca-Cola walked into this situation where they're like, oh, Pepsi tastes better, we need to be more like Pepsi. And they almost destroyed everything that they had built because they were trying to be something else. Coke looked like they were running scared from the Pepsi challenge, and in a sense they were. They had forgotten that Coke was more than a drink. It was, in some ways, a part of the fabric of people's lives. And Coca-Cola fans in particular weren't fans of change. And I don't say that just as a blanket statement about consumers not being fans of change. I mean specifically that people who love Coke, or at least at this time, people who loved Coke, were judged by Coke themselves to be more resistant to change than people who drank Pepsi. According to their own research, Coke drinkers tended to experience the world as a, quote, traditional reality based on early experiences, stereotypes, and cultural generalizations, and ruled by certain self-evident truths, end quote.
That's getting deep for a soda company to like categorize their entire base as that.
I don't think they categorized their entire base, but they knew ahead of time that the people who preferred Coke, the biggest fans of Coke, were the kind of people who hated things that changed. And then they decided to change and be just like the thing that wasn't Coke. Coke drinkers could accept Diet Coke because it didn't supplant the original Coke. And they could accept corn syrup because most of them couldn't taste the difference. But changing the taste of Coke itself was tantamount to changing the nature of reality. The rest, as they say, is history. Coca-Cola caved to public pressure and brought back their original flavor as Coca-Cola Classic.
How long did that take?
79 days.
That is not long for a major corporation to completely change gears.
It is not. And you have to understand, there were hardcore fans who were going out, buying up the entire stock that they could find of the original Coke. There were people writing them letters and angry hotline calls and all kinds of very vocal Coke fans just making a stink about how bad this decision was. They caught so much flack. It's debatable whether the general public hated New Coke as much as the people who were yelling about it made it seem like that they did. But that vocal minority, because they were the core Coke fans, were enough to move the needle and really make Coke reconsider, okay, let's go back to the old formula and call it Classic. And they did keep New Coke around for a while. Eventually they would call it Coke 2, the thing that they absolutely didn't want to do. But these days it is long gone. Although they did bring it back for a Stranger Things revival, which...
Yeah, I'm kind of disappointed that I did not get a chance to try that.
It's one of those things, it's probably just a can of soda, Tony. I mean, really...
Probably.
I don't care that much about soda anyway. I enjoy drinking Coke Zero for whatever reason. I don't usually give Diet Pepsi a chance because I'm happy with what I normally drink, but I don't think that I have any real strong opinions about it.
One of our patrons has the strongest opinion I've ever seen on anything in the entire world about Diet Pepsi being the best drink. So what up, Miranda?
I don't want to fight you as long as you don't. Yeah. As long as you don't hurt me for what I'm doing.
There's a pretty good chance that she'd fight you over it.
Well, I want to close with a quote. And this is a quote from Coke president Roberto Goizueta, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing. And this is something that he said in 1981, 4 years before New Coke hit the market. He said, "There is a danger when a company is doing as well as we are, and that is to think that we can do no wrong. I keep telling the organization, we can do wrong, and we can do wrong big." And Roberto, despite being cognizant of that fact, despite being, from everything I can tell, a very smart and savvy business person who ran Coke pretty well through the years that he was in charge, was still able to make a terrible decision like New Coke. Nobody's immune from bad ideas. And to me, the bad idea here is not being able to focus on the correct part of the story. Coke let Pepsi set the narrative with the Pepsi Challenge. Despite their best efforts, they were sucked into their competitor's frame of mind, and they believed that Coca-Cola was just a drink. They forgot that it was also an icon. And that is all we have for this week. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I hope it gave you a little more context for New Coke. As I mentioned at the beginning, everybody's heard of this. They know that it flopped, but it was really interesting to me to see why it flopped and the little details. And if you are interested in even more details, I would highly recommend that you check out this book, God, Country, and Coca-Cola. It is heavily researched. It goes into the entire history of Coca-Cola. I only read like 3 chapters of it, and even that was just fascinating. I'm actually really looking forward to one day, maybe when my kids have grown, Tony, having some time to actually read the whole book, because it just delighted me.
Someday.
We will see you guys on someday in the future, and we hope that you will tell a friend about us so that they can join us as well. You should also check us out over on Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes, where you will get these an entire week earlier than everyone else. You will be ready for the bad idea before your friends are. Bad ideas taste better than Coca-Cola.
Yes.
Take the bad ideas challenge, and we'll see you guys next week.
Also, nobody ever got diabetes from listening to bad ideas.
Accurate.